My name is Husnara Begum, and I'm the Associate Editor and Career Coach at cheekandittle.careers.com. I'm delighted to be joined for this short video by my mentee, Robert Greene. I was initially drawn to Robert because he's a career changer and is in the process of switching from working as a journalist to becoming a lawyer. That's the polar opposite of what I did. So those of you who are familiar with my background will know that I started life as a trainee solicitor at a Magic Circle firm, and then at about 3 years PQE decided that law wasn't for me longer term, and I decided to make a switch to journalism. So we thought it'd be quite interesting for us to swap stories about the switches we made and what motivated us to do it, so on and so forth, and to share some of our experiences of doing so and any tips and advice that we can offer to any of you who are considering doing something similar. So good to see you again, Robert. How have you been since we last spoke?
Yes, very good, thank you. I think this is, as you said, a really interesting chat. It's such an interesting phenomenon, the fact that we've both done career changes essentially in the opposite directions and met each other halfway through, if you like. So I'm really interested to know why you've made the change to journalism and to see if your motivations are essentially the opposite to mine.
For me, it was quite an easy transition. The reason being is that I wanted to be a lawyer as a sort of afterthought. Initially, from about the age of 13, I was a keen viewer of Blue Peter, and I was determined to be the first Asian and disabled Blue Peter presenter. Unfortunately, Connie Hock beat me to that accolade, but it didn't stop me from thinking I wanted to pursue a career as a journalist. But as luck would have it, I ended up being advised by lots of people that doing a journalism degree isn't considered as sort of prestigious as doing law. And I was told that because I was predicted decent A-level grades, law is a far safer career path to follow, albeit quite competitive. So I ended up studying law at university, and the rest they say is history. I was on that conveyor belt without really coming up for air, bowed to peer pressure. Everyone was pursuing sort of interest in commercial law, and that's how I ended up in the city without really properly thinking it through. And I suspect that's why I ended up not sticking with it. So when I made the decision to switch or leave the profession, because I'd had this burning desire way back to be a journalist, the swap was quite easy for me. How about you?
Well, mine is sort of interesting because I knew from a very young age that I was interested in writing. So that's when my initial interest in journalism came. I liked doing creative writing. I used to do a bit of poetry. I wrote my own fantasy novel when I was 16. And so I loved writing. So I thought, I would love to be a journalist. I was very good at English in school. And I decided, similar to you, to not do a journalism degree because I got similar advice about not doing a straightforward journalism degree, but actually broadening your horizons and doing a different discipline and then bringing that knowledge in. So I decided to do business and French. And the idea was I one day will become a business journalist. And so when I finished my business degree, I worked for a year at the French embassy in Ireland. And then I went on to study a journalism degree. And it was when I was doing my journalism degree that I actually studied media law. And I absolutely loved media law. And that's actually, ironically, when I decided to study law. When I was studying journalism, I decided I wanted to become a lawyer. So for me, I suppose working as a journalist was really interesting. I mean, I'm really interested in people and I'm really interested in writing, as I said, but also just telling stories. I was a video journalist, so a lot of the stuff I did was kind of through video rather than writing. But what I found very distressing, maybe for me personally in the journalism industry, was that it wasn't, like you said, a very rigid career. It's not linear. It's not very structured. It's quite fluid. It's less secure, as you said. And actually, that didn't sit well with me at all. I'm a very organized person. I like certainty. I like clear career progression. I like things to be a little bit more certain.
journalism does have quite a lot of overlap with law, because law is part of the services industry. It's about relationship building with clients so that they give you repeat business. With journalism, yes, a lot of it is centered around writing, but I think a far more important part of journalism, which so many people forget, is relationship building. Because in order to get those juicy stories that hit the front page, or that will become the next breaking news story, you need to have relationships or built on trust with key influential figures, whether that's industry leaders. In my case, that was partners in law firms, because I was a legal journalist. And so that's where there was an overlap. And that's a really good piece of advice for anyone considering switching careers, which is think about precisely what it is on a day-to-day basis that you enjoy doing. So for us, it was easy because we knew exactly which route to go down. Other career changes I speak to do have that block. They know that they want something different, but they're not sure how to go about it. So focusing on skills is a really smart way of approaching a potential switch. It also enables you to fill in those dreaded application forms, because would you not say transferable skills are absolutely key when it comes to making a change?
Yeah, definitely. I think just to pick up on the point you said there about, you want to change, but you don't necessarily know what it is. I think a really good tip I found anyway was definitely speaking to people who are in that field. Obviously, everyone's experience is individual, but I had a really close friend, actually, I lived with her, who was a solicitor. So I had a really good insight into her day-to-day life. And I loved getting involved and helping her, not with her clients, but in different matters in the house and stuff. She was really on top of our lease, everything. And I loved getting involved in it as well. So, I think if you can talk to people who are in the profession, even if it's formal or informal networking, that's a really good way to get a sense of maybe whether a career is for you or not. I think, though, in terms of transferable skills, absolutely. And I would completely agree with you that there's a lot of overlapping skills probably between journalism and being a lawyer. I know in my applications, things which I try to emphasize are communication skills. I think any journalist would say, you have to be able to write concisely and accurately, but you also need to be able to speak accurately and be able to, as you say, build relationships with people. So as a journalist, as you said, you're trying to build trust with people so that you'll get the great story, but with clients, you're trying to build a relationship with them so you'll get more work. I think the other really big skill that you get as a journalist, and I think this is probably relevant to lots of lawyers, is that impartiality, especially if you do broadcast journalism, which is what I did. It's very heavily regulated by Ofcom, so you must be impartial as a journalist. And I think lots of people always ask you when you're going to be, when I certainly said I want to be a lawyer, how can you represent, this person, or what if this firm is, working for this person, and actually that belief in, everybody has a right to justice, and, you represent people because they are your clients. Similarly, everybody has a right to have their story told. And as a journalist, you need to be able to be impartial. You can't give somebody who's a conservative a harder time because you're a Labour supporter. You have to give everybody a fair go, if you like. So I think there's so much overlap between the two.
Did you at any point think, I can't do this?
I think in the beginning, I had the fear that I was just too old. And I think that's probably what a lot of career changers fear. I think especially with law, because as I said, one of the things that attracted to me about the career was that it was a very clear career progression. But actually, lots of people jump onto that career progression in their early 20s. And I had already done a few degrees, I'd already worked. So for me, it was like, oh my God, I'm going to qualify so much later. There's just no point. And so I just remember trying to get over that was really difficult in the beginning. I think the second point when I thought, oh my God, I can't do this, was when I kind of got into it and I was working full-time and studying part-time and trying to make applications at the same time. And it was I just didn't have the capacity of myself as a 20-year-old doing full-time study to go to all of the law events, to network all the time, to get loads of applications done, to do pro bono work. I just couldn't do that. And I just remember thinking, I'm too late in the game. I don't have the capacity to do what I would have done when I was 20 in terms of making applications. I just can't do it. So I definitely think I've had those moments, but I've managed to overcome them. I don't know if you did on the opposite way, in terms of journalism has a very, most journalists are trained as journalists. Did you have a fear when you were kind of going into the industry about not having the skills to write or to, get good stories?
No, probably because, I had quite a lot of self-belief and I knew I could do this. And in a way, for me, because I had cracked, getting into one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, I had that sort of air of confidence. For me, the challenges were more at a practical level. So, number one, financial. And I think this is a fear that so many career changes have because my salary went down by 2/3. And again, if you are a career changer, you've got to ask yourself, how badly do you want this? Because a lot of people will say, I can't afford to do this. And I could easily have used that argument because at the time I had a mortgage. But if every situation or most situations will have a alternative sort of outcome depending on how you tackle it. So for me, I knew I desperately wanted to do it. So I put my friend's flat up for rent and I moved it back in with my parents for a good 18 months or so before I could then come back to the flat. The other point that you raised about age, again, another sort of self-limiting belief that so many career changers use as a way of stopping themselves from moving the dial forward. I have people in my network who have qualified as solicitors in their late 30s and 40s. I know somebody who's qualified at the age of 50. So for me, age is an attitude. It's about staying relevant, staying up to date with what's going on around you. What other practical challenges did you sort of find? Because I think we've spoken privately, haven't we, about the money side of things?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that you said about having to take the pay cut. And I've sort of had financial challenges as well. To fund my GDL, so I'm funding that myself. So that was my reason for, I suppose, studying part-time and working full-time, because I just couldn't afford to do it otherwise. So that was a huge commitment. And I knew before going in that I had to realistically think about how am I going to make 30 grand to pay for my GDL and LBC in the case that I don't get sponsored by a law firm. So that was in my head a big mental block. But then once I'm even getting into the industry now and starting to, reach out to firms in terms of doing some pro bono work or doing, some freelance work, I'm realizing I'm actually suddenly, having made so much progression in one industry in journalism, I'm now finding myself at the bottom of the ladder, if you like, in another industry, and then having to, build myself up again in terms of the pay scale. And that is really challenging. And it's definitely, I think a lot of people's self-worth is actually wrapped up in their salary and their title. And
Absolutely.
I think that can be really self-destructive. You can bring yourself down, look at your peers and think, gosh, they're this far in this career, and if I just stuck it out, I could have been there. But deep down, I know I always would have regretted if I hadn't made the change. So that's how I try to rationalize it. In 30, 40 years, you won't care, how much you were earning in 2000 and whatever. You'll be happy you made the change because this was what you wanted to do. I don't know if you've had that same sort of feeling.
Of course I do, because when I first left law, switching in the direction I went from law to non-law, I think is arguably harder, because for so many lawyers, their job title defines them, and I I managed to find a job as a journalist pretty quickly. I think my gap between leaving Linklaters, my old firm, to getting to the lawyer where I started my journalism career was really 6 weeks, of which the bulk of that was spent on a journalism course. And so when I started at the lawyer as a journalist, and I really enjoyed it, but I would have some sleepless nights thinking, have I just wasted all that training? Have I wasted that title that took me so many years to get, and so many people are still desperately trying to get, that practical certificate that they want to sort of get their hands on. So it was a massive psychological adjustment. As I said, financially, it was a big adjustment. But the advice I would give as a career coach to anyone considering a career change, when it comes to age, as I said, that's really a self-limiting belief and a something you can do quite a lot about. With regard to the money side of things, 2 points. Firstly, do some serious budgeting rather than making those unhelpful, sweeping, generalized statements about how you can't afford to do it. And connected to that, think about your earnings longer term. Because yes, you do need to go back to the bottom rung of the ladder in most instances, and that will inevitably mean a pay cut for a lot of people. But the good thing about entering the profession as a career changer is that you already have skills that your fresh-faced undergrads aren't going to have. So there is potential for your career progression to be fast-tracked, which means that you could soon earn decent money again. So it is a short-term blip in terms of earnings rather than long-term. If I had to share my practical tips on changing careers, they would be as follows. Firstly, research different areas that you're interested in. And as you very rightly pointed out, I think it's very important to supplement any desk-based research you do on the internet with networking and talking to people who have first-hand experiences of the sectors that you're interested in joining. And be quite specific about what you're trying to achieve, because I've spoken to some career changers who will say, I want to go and work in a charity. That's not really a job title or a job spec, that's just a sector. In the same way, you could say, Hasnara, I want to work in law. That's just way too broad, because that could involve working in the legal sector as a non-solicitor or a non-barrister. So there's that. As we've highlighted, take advantage of those all-important transferable skills, experiment, and the other really important consideration is your narrative. So coming up with a nice sort of elevator pitch, explaining your motivations for switching and what you can bring to the party. Anything you wanted to add there before we finish?
The only other tip really I would do is say, try to gain some, if you can, practical experience. I know I spoke earlier on about, and you mentioned there about speaking to somebody, but there's always opportunities. When I was working in media, I was able to do some shadowing of some of the lawyers at some of the broadcasters. I was able to, do some informal networking, do some voluntary work with some legal centers. So try to gain, if you can, if you wanted to be a journalist, for example, and you're a student, for example, getting involved in your student newspaper. There are lots of places who will be happy to give you, an opportunity to do some voluntary work. And unfortunately, at the beginning, you do sometimes have to just take some free work and not be paid, but to get that little bit of exposure, just so you can really get a sense of whether it's for you. And I also think just big thing is confirmation bias. I think we all are guilty of this. It's just thinking, this is what I want to do, and I'm only going to accept information that confirms that this is for me. And then you ignore all the information that's telling you, the red alert that's saying, this, I hate this, I didn't like that. You kind of ignore it and you just say, yep, you take all the pieces of information that confirm what you want. And I think we're all guilty of it. We're probably without even realizing it. So I think that would be a big tip.
That's a fantastic point. I'm really glad you raised it, because I do think that there's often a mismatch between perception and reality. And just to wrap up, that reality check piece is so important, both in terms of what is the reality of doing a job that you're interested in potentially pursuing, and what are your realistic chances of doing this. But make sure that when you are doing any reality checking conversations, that it's based on evidence and facts rather than people's, experiences, which usually are quite unique to them and may not be in any way relevant to your circumstances. So anyway, look, lovely as ever catching up with you, Robert. Wishing you the best of luck with this switch. I know you've still got a long way to go. And I look forward to catching up with you again very soon.